anyway, yes, I'm going to speak on Grunt-ify your front-end development. And this talk kind of bridges the gap between someone who has never used Grunt. So for the first part of the talk, we'll just talk about getting started. Some people have not used it at all. We'll talk about why you need it, and then also we'll get to a point where, hey, here's this nice Grunt file, and it's really huge and unmanageable, and what do we do next? How can we make this so it's not so crazy? So then we'll look at some tools to really help split them out, organize, make them modular. And once we get to that point, when we feel pretty good about that, we'll talk about some nice tasks that are kind of relatively new that you could inject into your application. And some nice ones, just some nice integrations with your IDE on how you could automate some of these things, and just make a good experience. And obviously there are other tools that you could use to automate your front end. But we're not going to talk about those necessarily, and but I'll touch on some of the others that you could use. So anyway, I'm Elijah. You can find me on Twitter at Elijah Manor, and I'm a Christian. I have a family with 3 kids and 1 wife, and I work at Dave Ramsey in Nashville, Tennessee, and I have some Pluralsight videos. I'm pretty much a front-end only developer. I really like that. Over time, I've just really focused more on the front end, so it's something I really enjoy. So when we lead to the idea of automation, usually as a programmer, this is from XKCD, you think, hey, I have this work, I have to do a lot, so I'm going to write some code for a little bit, and it's going to make all my problems go away in the end. I'll never have to do anything ever again. That's the ideal theory, but sometimes when you actually look at the bottom here, you're writing some code, and then, oh, this is more difficult than I thought, and then I have to start debugging something, and then you're really spending a lot more time just maintaining this cool tool than actually doing the work. So hopefully Grunt won't be that story for you, but as you're initially learning it, you might find yourself spending more time in Grunt than actually doing the work. But once everything gets laid out and you're in a good groove, it should make your life a lot easier. As I mentioned before, there are tons of tools, really old ones to like new ones, that do the same thing as what Grunt does. It's basically just a build tool. It's a way to automate things that you have to do manually. Make has been around forever. Ant, there's inant for like .NET. I used to use that. Rake for like Ruby people. And Grunt has been around for a couple years. Gulp is a newer one you've probably heard of. And really, they both could do the same things. It's just how do you like to automate your stuff? And Broccoli is a new one. I haven't even used that, but that sounds funny. But anyway, it kind of makes you like pull your hair out or do a triple palm face. Like, hey, let's just pick one and use it well. In my case, I'm a front-end developer, so a front-end tool, one that's written in JavaScript and allows me to make custom tasks in JavaScript makes a lot of sense for me because I like JavaScript. And so if loving JavaScript is wrong, then I don't want to be right. And I did this silly thing where I made the JS turn into a heart. Oh yeah, I did that. So anyway, it was just fun to do. But anyway, so Grunt is a task runner, and with it, you probably have lots of things in your development workflow, like you maybe use CoffeeScript or ES6, ECMAScript 6, and so you have to cross-compile that into ES5. Or you want to hint your code to make sure you're following some guidelines, or using required. All these tools you have to do manually, but Grunt could automate all these and tons more. But this is just kind of like a high-level overlook. Tons of people use Grunt. Twitter, jQuery Core uses Grunt to automate all their things. Ben Allman is the creator of Grunt, and he is a core contributor to jQuery, so that makes sense to be there. Adobe Modernizer, tons of WinJS, the new version they put out recently, uses Grunt and under the covers to build other things. Very prevalent. And again, Gulp, you're starting to see Gulp come more and more, but Grunt very much is way up there. The cool thing about Grunt, it has a very active community, lots of contributors, watchers, tons of plugins. Ben Allman used to be known as the jQuery plugin guy. Like, hey, there's a plugin for that, and Ben probably wrote it. Well, he's now he's the Grunt guy, so there's tons of Grunt plugins, and he's, again, written many of them. So that's where his passion has been recently. All right, so now that we know there's tons of tools, and let's just pick one, and let's see what we actually do. So this will be a quick overview of how to get started, and then we'll talk about how to clean it up. And then we'll do a demo showing some of the integrations and some of the nice things that you may or may not think is cool, even outside of Grunt. Like, oh, that's cool. I didn't realize I could do that with my IDE. So let's get started. First, you need Node, so because we're going to use that to run all of our JavaScript. So if you're on OS X, if you're using a Mac, you could use Fink, Brew, or Port, and those are all pretty common ways to install to Node or other things. Or if you're on Windows, you could. There's several ways to do that. There's something called Cience with Chocolatey. Or you could just download, there's like an executable from the Node website. And a lot of people just kind of do that to begin with. I'm not sure why I just got this. Are we still going, Ralph?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. For some reason, my GoToMeeting panel just came up. So yeah, some people just go to the website and download the executable and install that way. But if you like command line, this is the way you could do it. So once you have Node installed, you need to install the Grunt CLI. That's the command line interface. And so in your console, you'd say npm install -g, which means global. You want everyone to have access to Grunt CLI. So no matter what folder you're in or directory, you could call this command. And so Grunt CLI is everywhere. It's a two-step process where historically, old versions of Grunt, there was only one step. You just installed Grunt. But it became a problem where different projects within your same, like if you're working on 5 different projects, some of them could be on older versions of Grunt, and some might be on newer versions of Grunt. And if you have a global version of Grunt, then you have inconsistencies across projects. And so they kind of split it out into 2 parts. One is just the common interface, and then individually you install Grunt in each project separately. So each one could be on different versions. So step 1 is just install it globally. And then you have 2 main pieces. You need your package.json file, which describes, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but it describes all your dependencies, your project name, things like that. And then you have your grunt file, and that's where you describe all the tasks you want to run, like I want to hint my code, or I want to use autoprefixer, or run Sass, things like that. So again, the package.json is a place to put a lot of different pieces of information. The version of your project, the homepage URL, like if it's on GitHub, dependencies, and for this part, most of the stuff we'll put are dev dependencies. And so if I did want to run JSHint, I'd have to tell Grunt that I need to know about the Grunt JSHint plugin, and I would define that in the dev dependencies. So it would know that it needs to use it. There's actually this cool cheat sheet, bit.ly/npm-cheat sheet. If it comes up. Well, it's taking a while now, but it's this interactive, here's a screenshot of it. It's this interactive web page where it describes all the different pieces of package.json, and you could click on each one, and it'll actually describe what that means and how you should use it. So it's really kind of clever. I don't know if the site's currently down or not, but I'll give you the link so you can look at it on your own. So the next thing, you actually want to create a package.json. An easy way to do this is just to say npm init on the command line, and then it'll start asking you different questions, like the name of your project. So here I'm making a directory, I'm getting into it, and then I say npm init, and it starts asking me questions like what's the name of my app, what's the version, blah, blah, blah. You eventually, in the final output, is a pretty small package.json. And from there, you can start adding to it. So the next thing you'd want to do is install Grunt in your project. And so you do npm install Grunt, and that will install a version of Grunt for your project. And then the important thing is to say save --save-dev. And what that will do is it'll inject in the dev dependencies of your package.json file what you just installed. So if we so let's go to another one. Let's say we're going to install Grunt contrib JSHint because we want to hint our JavaScript, and we'll say --save-dev. After I did both of those things, we'll get a package.json file that looks much like this because we did the init, and then we installed 2 packages. And you'll notice in the dev dependencies, it put Grunt in there, and it actually told which version it installed, and it listed Grunt contrib JSHint, and it told what version it installed. the reason this is helpful is, like, let's say you checked all this into GitHub, and then someone else pulled it down. They would run npm install, and it would look in here, figure out all the things it needs, go out and get them, and pull them down. So this is really helpful for people who are just starting from anew or from scratch, or if you want to update the packages that you already have. It knows where to go look for the things. All right, once you have those two main pieces in place, now let's unpack the Gruntfile a little bit and talk about the main pieces that you need to be concerned about to make our plain Jane Gruntfile that you've probably seen many times on blog posts if you've used Grunt before. And then we'll take that and actually split it out and do something a little more nice. So we have our module wrapper, which is the main part of Grunt. We have to init it, load all the associated tasks, and then register any particular tasks. So the wrapper is really easy because it's Node, so we need to make a module wrapper. So we just say module exports, and then we have a function. And so that's our wrapper. Very simple, 2 lines of code. But the main part where usually you see a lot of Grunt files on the web, most of the stuff is in this init config. And so whatever things that you're including, like JSHint, for example, you would have a little section, a JSHint key in the object. And then you would have all the options describing what you want to do, like all the files to look for. So I want to lint the Gruntfile.js and any JavaScript file under source and any JavaScript file under test. And then you could pass in like any settings that you care about or any globals. After you've done the config, and I've kind of collapsed that because that was a lot of code, at the end you normally see, like if you go to gruntjs.com, you see you have to load the npm tasks. So for each item in init config, usually you see a corresponding load npm task and the name of the task that is in your package.json file, which seems a little redundant. It's like, well, if it's in the package.json, why do I have to repeat it? But that's just something you have to do. The Grunt file the Grunt tool, automation program, has to know where to look to pull the functionality. And so that's a very important piece. And at the very end, you actually register different tasks. And so in this case, we want a default task. So if I type grunt on the command line, I need to define what that's going to do. So in this case, if someone just says grunt, it will run JSHint. And this is an array, so I could have multiple things that it should do. But this is the most simple case where I said, and so I could have multiple register tasks, but this is pretty much the plainest Jane version. All right, so this is what you might get if you've kind of fleshed out a little bit of your Grunt file. Again, we have the wrapper at the top, module exports. We have our init config with quite a few things in here. We're actually creating this package key, and we're reading in the package.json file and storing it in package. And we'll reuse that later, like to pull out the name of the package of our project, possibly the version, things like that. So here we have a concat task, which is going to combine certain JavaScript files together. We're going to uglify it, which we're going to minify and obscure that, and we're going to add a banner to it. So this file gets out of hand pretty quickly. We define our unit tests, we hint our code, and then we have a watch. And so the watch is cool, and you're probably familiar with this system. A lot of build tools have it where you could kind of set up a watch for certain folders on your computer, and if any files change in those folders or match whatever I put in files, then it will kick off a build. And I'm telling you, if any of these files change, JSHint files, which is, if any of these files change up here, I want you to, like if someone changed it and said save, then I want you to go and run JSHint, and then immediately after run the unit tests. And this maps to this key. So QUnit would map up here. That would tell the QUnit task to, oh, I need to look at these files and run them. And then you notice at the bottom we have to load all those tasks manually. And at the bottom we register 2 different tasks. A default one, so if I just said grunt, it would run the hinting, it would run the unit tests, it would concat all our files, and then it would uglify them. And then we register another task just called test. So if I said grunt space test, it'll hint all our code and then run the unit tests. So you could have as many of these as you want, but you notice the file's getting really large, and we're not doing a whole bunch yet. one of the several of the apps that I'm working on today, like if I had put everything in one file like this, it would be very unmanageable. So you don't want to barf like a white horse, I guess. I don't know. It needs some organization. So let's take a look at what we could do to make this a little bit more sane. So the first part, like, didn't loading each npm module seemed very repetitive because we listed those things in our package JSON. So it wouldn't be cool if it just was smart enough. So goodbye repetitive code. So all this code, we could just get rid of it. There's another npm package called load grunt tasks. And all I have to do is say require load grunt tasks, pass in grunt, and it will automatically look in the package JSON file under dev dependencies and say, oh, well, I probably need all these things. And so it goes and does all that for you. So instead of these 5 lines of code, you just need 1. And as your grunt file gets larger and larger, you'll probably use more and more plugins, and so, but you still only have 1 line now because it's smart enough to do all that work for you. So that's one kind of nice thing. But you're still repeating in your init config, you still have all those blocks of definition configurations for each task. So that's still kind of cumbersome. So the next place you would want to go, instead of using load grunt tasks, there's yet another package called load grunt config. And this is the one I use. And so now our grunt file is very small. It's 3 lines of code. So instead of all those other steps I had to do, boom, 3 lines. My wrapper, and then I just said, hey, I'm going to require load grunt config. Now, what does that do behind the scenes? Well, under the covers, it actually uses the previous slide code. So it will automatically look in the package JSON, look at all your dev dependencies, and say, oh, well, you need to load those, so I'll do that for you. But then it goes one step further and says, okay, well, where do I init all this information? Where's the configuration for each task? And so what it does, it actually looks into a grunt folder, and each task has its own file, which is pretty cool. So let's look at what that looks like. So what you do, your main app would be here. You'd have a grunt file at your root, and you'd have your package JSON at your root. And again, your package JSON defines all your dev dependencies. This special load grunt config tool will look in a grunt folder, and if it needs to figure out what options to use for a grunt task, it'll actually look at a file name with that same key. So for example, JSHint was the key, and we defined all the rules of what files to JSHint. Well, it'll be looking for a jshint.js file, and that's where we'll find all the information. So it really helps organize your code quite a bit. And in the aliases, that's where you define all your tasks. So in my alias YAML file, I'd say default task, and then just list out the things I want it to do. And I want a test task, and I want you to run jshint, and then my QUnit tests. So for example, if we wanted to convert part of our app to use this new technique, under the grunt folder, we would have like an uglify file, a JavaScript file, and inside of it, we would say module exports, and then we would put all the options that we need to describe the uglify.js. And again, this is the same code that we saw in the really big file, but now it's much smaller, it's isolated, and it's exactly what we need, which is nice. And what I tend to like to do with my jshint is I use a jshint RC file. So instead of putting all my logic of oops, not there. All my logic of what globals I expect and which rules I want to turn on or off, like if I want triple equals or double equals, things like that. Instead of putting them all in my jshint.js file, I'll put those in a jshint RC, which is where it will look for all that configuration information. So that way I could change it globally for everything and not really have to worry about it. And between project and project, I could kind of carry that dot file with me and kind of set a standard for most of my projects, which is really nice. So when we're done, my grunt file normally looks like this. It's one extra line of code. There's a time grunt plugin, which is really nice, and I'll add that in there. And what that does, it'll actually look at all the tasks that's running in Grunt and actually tell you how much time each one takes, and I'll actually show you a little graph, which is really nice. When things kind of get large and out of hand, you start making small changes here and there in your grunt file, and all of a sudden it bloats like crazy, or it takes a long time. You're like, what just happened? you could, in the console, when you run Grunt, it'll actually tell you, oh wow, that one small change I just made slowed down my build by 10 seconds, which is a lot if you're building all the time. So after our package JSON might look like this. Here's our name, the version, and then we have all these dependencies. And so again, our tool automatically looks in here and says, oh, I need to load these. So obviously I already defined them, so I need to load them, which is really kind of nice. In our old grunt file, we had grunt register task default, and then we listed all the things to do. And then we had a test, but you also could have a dis. This is how you do it in the new land. Under grunt, you'd have the aliases YAML, and here you define default here, and then you would just list all the items that you want to run. And if you've never used YAML before, it's pretty easy to pick up. You just use these dashes, and it will create that into an array, much like what this is over here. Same thing with this. You tell it what you want to do, and it just maps it right over. So it's really kind of nice. So you have one main file to go to for all the tasks, and then each individual file for each subtask. So the folder structure that the app uses is more like this. We have our grunt file again, the grunt folder, and here are the ones I converted. We have the concat, a JS hint, node unit, notify, uglify, and watch. And yeah, and here's my unit test. So it cleans it up quite a bit. It's much more manageable. If you want to get started with Grunt, like you wanted to create a new Grunt plugin from scratch, or you want to create a jQuery plugin, Grunt actually understands project scaffolding. Now, this is where you might want to go to use Yeoman instead, because it's really good at that. Yeoman initially, Grunt was around a lot longer than Yeoman, so Grunt kind of did all this scaffolding type stuff, and then Yeoman came along, and so Yeoman uses Grunt, but it doesn't. It uses something different for the scaffolding. But anyway, it's kind of cumbersome. I don't normally use it, but if you want a little bit of help getting started with some things, you could install the grunt init, and then you have to install all the little templates that it'll use. But in the end, you could say grunt init. I want to create a new grunt file, and it'll just generate a scaffold of a starting point. Again, for the most part, I usually create like a simple project of how I want my grunt configured, and then I work from there, because this one will generate a real simple one, which you probably don't want to start with. Inevitably, you'll get to the point where you're doing something with Grunt and it just doesn't make sense. Like, it's not working, it's not doing what I want, it's throwing an error, I have no idea what's going on. Well, there's several things that you could do. One, when you run Grunt, you could pass -- stack, and that'll print a stack trace showing you exactly what warning or error that occurred. Something that I usually also do, -- verbose gives you a lot more information of what commands it's running, what options are being passed into each task, and that sometimes could be helpful trying to determine what might be going on if things aren't working as expected. All right, now plugins. Plugins are obviously the place that bring a lot of the value with Grunt. If Grunt didn't have plugins, you'd be running all of it yourself. Some of the common things, usually you want to definitely want to compress and minify your JavaScript, so you can do that with uglify. Definitely you can minify your CSS. Some people actually minify their HTML, so you got all this markup, but you have all this extra white space or things you don't need. Well, you could run that through HTML min. A lot of people forget to compress their images, so it's pretty important to minify your images. You can either lossily compress it, meaning you just take out information that's not needed. Your naked eye could still see the same quality, but you're kind of removing a bunch of extra information that isn't needed. So that's usually pretty helpful, especially images are, for the most part, the biggest part of your website. And if you use SVG, which is kind of coming back to be very popular these days because it scales well for responsive sites, there's tools to minify that as well, because there's usually a lot of cruft, because it's XML, that you can kind of remove and tighten up. And a tool that I've been using recently that I really like, and this is more code quality, so I've mentioned JS hint, and you've probably been aware of JS lint or JS hint or ES lint. they all essentially do the same thing, where they look for things that are common problems that people accidentally put in their code, or things that could be an issue down the road, and they usually identify like, maybe you shouldn't do that way, and stuff like that. Well, JSCS is kind of in the same vein, but this is more like code style. Like, hey, did you put a space between your parentheses and an if statement? Or, are you using tabs or spaces, which is a common one, which JSHint does that. But JSCS goes one step further. Hey, did you use brackets, curly brackets? Did you have a carriage return after your else, or did you not have a carriage return? Like, you could enforce all these different rules. So it's really cool. So the people behind the jQuery team are part of this project, which is really cool too. And so you could also point to a common file, like a dot file like JSCSRC, which defines all those rules. And let's say you pulled those rules in, but there's a couple of them you want to tweak out. Well, you could add some extra ones. Sometimes I override like a maximum length. Maybe Google says it has to be 80 characters. Well, I could override that and say, well, I want all of Google's rules, but I'm going to tweak out a couple. And for example, and that's cool because they've already rounded up the project, basically defined tons of different preset guidelines. Like Crockford has his own coding guidelines. Google does. jQuery has their own guidelines that, if you're a jQuery developer that you want to commit to core, you have to follow certain rules. And the JSCS team has predefined all these presets with the rules that are obeyed within, if we go to the contribute.jquery.org/style-guide/js, it defines all the rules. Well, JSCS figured out those rules in words and converted them into code, which is really neat. And so in my JSCSRC, I would say I want to preset to jQuery, but I might want to change the indentation to 2 instead of whatever it has. And you could selectively override things, or you could just say I want to make my own custom preset and define everything. But it's a little overwhelming. I've looked through some of these presets, and it's kind of a lot. So I would recommend either finding one that you like that's mostly close to your code style, and then slightly tweaking it out. But it'll really help if you have more than one developer on your team, it'll really help bring some consistency to the front-end development. My team has 3 front-end guys, and so it's kind of important that our code kind of feels similar and we're kind of obeying certain standards, both with JSHint and JSRC. The next thing I found recently, and I really love it, I've been doing a lot of SAS recently, SCSS, and there's a linter for that. Who knew? So I pretty much lint everything. The main feature of SCSS lint that I love is being able to identify how specific a selector could be. So sometimes you could just, if you repeat, have a selector space, or like a space div space something, it could track those, but it could also track the indentation. So if I have a and then I have a sub element selector and then a sub selector nested between that, it could actually track those as well. So what I do is say, hey, have a max depth of 3 or a max specificity of 3. And if you get above that, like 4 or above, it'll warn you or give you an error. And you have to decide, well, do I need to fix this somehow, or do I need to bump up my number for my application? I recently refactored a pretty large app, and I had the number set to 3 because I didn't want to go beyond 3. I was pulling in tons of CSS from lots of different places in SAS, and eventually I had to bump it to 4, but I felt pretty good about that because some of the stuff I was running against were like level 8, and I'm like, wow. So I was able to at least refactor that down to a 4, and I felt pretty good. So there were a couple places that violated it, but anyway, so again, you define all your rules of what you think is valid for SAS. We'll take a look at a couple of those in a second. So here this is my SCSS lint.js file. Here's where I describe the files I want to lint. So pretty much all my SAS. I usually have a shame folder, and it's shameful to put anything in it. This is something I saw Chris Corrier recommend. And usually you want to keep it empty, but sometimes, as hard as you try, there's going to be some things that either it's legacy stuff that you want to clean up, or it's something that you're not quite proud of. Maybe put it in there. And maybe you could lint those too, but in our case, we shoved them in shame because it wasn't following our naming standards. And eventually we'll, fix those. But some of the rules, and there's tons of rules. Me and another front-end guy, we went through all of them to figure out what we thought was appropriate for our apps. But some of them are like, hey, when you're using hex notation for colors, should it be uppercase or lowercase? Or your name format, should you use the BEM approach, a block element modifier? Or do you want hyphenated, or do you want to define some regular expression to define your names? And the selector depth is the one I find most helpful. And it's by default it's set to 3, but you could bump it up. And again, we pushed ours to 4. I'm not in love with that, but that's just what we had to do. And these are just tools. These are guidelines to help you figure out where your code base is at. They could always be tweaked. Another cool tool that came out recently that Adi Osmani, you might have seen come out, is Grunt-ify. So now that we've linted our Sass, which eventually spits out CSS, sometimes there's tons of CSS that we don't even use, like your app never uses it. You maybe defined it a long time ago, and your app just doesn't need it. Or maybe one app used it, but your app doesn't. So this tool basically analyzes the CSS that a site uses, and then it'll tell you it'll actually spit out a version of just the CSS that you need. And it removes all the cruft. Now this is a little tricky because as you're exercising your website, you might not be hitting every single piece that is used on your app, because the CSS that's spit out is the only CSS that's needed for the experience that you were clicking through. So it's really important that you click through all the permutations of what could possibly happen from a user. So it's a little danger there, but as long as you try it out and then maybe suck back in the CSS and then rerun through all your use cases and it still works, then you could possibly have a really small CSS file. This definitely could be helpful for like mobile, or if your site's responsive, to only pull the things that are necessary. Something I tend to do is also include the Grunt-notify plugin. So I usually have a Grunt watch going on, so any file I change, it's going to lint my code either through JSHint and JSCS to look for the the code standards, and then run the unit tests. And sometimes I don't always have that terminal in view, like it's behind a window, or I'm checking Twitter or whatever, and it fails. And sometimes I don't notice it failed. So having Grunt-notify is really cool because on a failure, it'll stick up some notification. So if it's on Windows, it could use, I forget it uses a program on Windows to do that. I don't remember which one it was. But if you're on OS X, it'll either use the native notification system, or it'll use tons of other notification systems. So I find that very helpful because I could be in the groove coding and then, my build failed, and it'll tell you what happened. So it's really helpful to get it in your face quickly. Since I run JSHint, I usually run JSHint stylish as well. It makes the error messages a lot more terse and clean. Otherwise, sometimes it could just go through your terminal and it's just a lot of information. So having it nice and clean is really nice. Another tool that I've used, working at Dave Ramsey, is our main page gets hit a lot, daveramsey.com. So we want to make sure, as much as possible, we have some legacy stuff we're trying to fight with, but as much as possible, we want it to be as fast, obviously. And so Grunt PageSpeed hooks into the Google PageSpeed API, and you could hit it against your page, and actually it'll give you the numbers that it would give you if you went to their website and typed in your URL. So that's really nice, and you can toggle that into your build system. There's another tool as well, Grunt Fantomas, which I think is pretty cool. It actually has graphs. So this will keep a history over time of how your site's doing. So like the response time, the latency, gzip size, things like that. And every time you run it, it'll add a point in time to the graph. And so you can kind of see over time if the latency is going up or down. It's really kind of cool. So you could define the things you want to look for, but the thing that's also cool is you could tell it, hit the site 10 times and then give me an average of what you found. Because sometimes, depending on the backend server, one time it might have been fast and one time slow. And so you could give it a threshold or give it a number of times to try, and it kind of averages that. So obviously you don't want to be pegging your production system too hard, so keep the number kind of low, or maybe you could peg your test system, maybe, I don't know. But I found it kind of useful, and the graphs are nice too. That's a little more nicer for people who aren't as don't like seeing data as much. And this is what I mentioned before, the time grunt. I use this; it's very helpful. When you run grunt or whatever task you're running, it'll split out all the subtasks and show you how much time it took in each thing. Now, in this case, it actually took more time to load all the configuration stuff than actually running anything else. But overall, it took a little over a second to do everything, so that's not too bad. Like a project that I recently joined, we're doing. Uses React, which we have to compile that. We use Browserify, so we have to. That's another compilation process, and then we go through. We use ES6, and so it has to go through another step, and so we can track more how much time each one's taking. And as the system gets larger and larger, hopefully these numbers aren't getting too crazy, and so that's really helpful. And again, as your app gets larger and larger physically, like some of these wildcard searches, like lint all the things. Well, those could get large as the project gets, over time. You start adding more and more files. A nice thing is to use Grunt newer. So what this will do is it will tell Grunt, okay, the first time you run the system, I want you to kind of cache everything. Timestamp, have this special cache. And then the next time, if you're doing a watch, for example, and I only change one file, well, there's no necessary reason to go and rerun everything if only that one thing changed. And so Grunt newer is supposed to, like if I only change one JavaScript file, we'll just hint that one. Don't worry about redoing everything from scratch. And so this could really speed up some time in your builds, especially if you have a watch task and you want it to be fast. So now we get to tooling. So if you use Chrome, I typically use Chrome, and I'm a glutton for punishment, so I tend to use Chrome Canary, which is like the daily build or whatever of Chrome. But there's a nice plugin into the DevTools called Grunt DevTools, and so up here next to the console, you just click Grunt, and if it recognizes that there's a Grunt file in that particular project that you're working on, then all the tasks will show up on the left. You could run a particular one, and then the output will be on the right. So that's kind of nice. You can actually have multiple projects up. You actually have to kick up. You have to go into each folder on your terminal and type grunt-devtools for it to know, for this tool to be aware of that the grunt file exists. But I just kick it off and have it running, and it works just fine. But it's pretty cool. WebStorm 8 now has built-in support for Grunt. So down here, it'll show a little Grunt window and have all the tasks, and you could run them. Visual Studio has a Grunt launcher, which is kind of similar, and it'll list all the versions. And I think there's another plugin that either has Grunt support or it's coming out for the Expression web version. But I'm not sure. I don't use Visual Studio on a daily basis. So what I use is Atom. I use GitHub's Atom, which is open source. And there's two ways that I actually there's three ways I personally will run Grunt. One, something called Grunt Runner. It's this little toolbar that shows up on the bottom. You can start. I don't really use this. I've tested it to see if it worked, but it seems a little cumbersome to me. I usually either use Term2, which is a way I can actually have a terminal window, like on the side or whatever, and I can actually run commands. I could, do a grunt watch right there while I'm in my ID, while I'm coding, and that's just kind of what I like. Or I'll just have iTerm2 open and have my console doing the watches. So I kind of flop back and forth between Term2 or just natively having a console open. But some of you might like the Grunt Runner. That is if you use Atom, which I really like. That's a different topic if you want to ask me about that later. So I've kept mentioning over and over that there is this other thing called gulp, and you'll probably see it's getting a lot of publicity, and it's really great. It has the idea of piping the output of one thing into another thing. And so what you'll find, instead of a lot of these configuration things that you'll find in Grunt, you'll find more code, like you're actually writing code to do one task and spit out into another. And if you like that kind of thing, that's great. I've really kind of gotten in a nice groove with Grunt. I like the way it's structured. Historically, things were kind of done in Grunt first, but then almost immediately a Grunt plug or a Gulp plugin would be made that does the same thing. When it comes down to it, both Grunt and Gulp, for the most part, that's not where the work is done. The work is actually done in a low-level node package. And so SCSS lint is a node package that technically run. Actually, that's not true. JSCS is a node package, and the Grunt task is a call through to it. And so the Gulp plugin is just a call through to the node one. SCSS lint is actually a Ruby gem. Unfortunately, there's not a node version of it yet, but Grunt will actually call the Ruby gem under the covers. So now it's demo time. I'll get to show like a real-world layout. Just kick the tires of the things that we've already talked about, but actually, show you. So again, I'll be using Atom. So here's our project. Over here we have our Grunt folder. Here's our aliases. That defines all of our tasks, and here's actually the options for all of our tasks. So let's first look in our package.json. Here's the name of my app. It's just my app, my version, and here's all my dev dependencies. So I have a lot of things. My JS hint, my watch, my node unit, some of the things I've talked about, like page speed and Fantomas, the minifying my CSS and things like that. But the cool thing, my grunt file is really small. It's actually more than 4 lines, like I mentioned. But I have the wrapper. I tell it I want it to time everything, so I want to see how long everything takes. And here's where I'll say load grunt config. And again, that's what goes into the package.json and says, oh, I want to load all these things. And so it just automatically does that for me. And this piece of code I didn't show in the slides, and the reason I have this right here is to pass some special information. So each of these files on the left, if they want to access the package object, they could actually use it. So in concat, for example, so it could use the package name, and it could work. Things like that. Here's my connect. Here's where I kick up a little web server, and I said, hey, I want you to keep alive, and I want you to use live reload. So let's go over here real quick. So I'll just say grunt. That runs everything. It has the times here on the bottom, which is nice. Then I can say grunt connect. That'll kick up a little web server. We'll go to, make this a little smaller. We'll go to localhost 9001. And here's the hello world site. And so now what we can do is we can make this a little bit smaller. We could go into our index page, or maybe our CSS. We could change it to red and save over here, and since we're using live reload, it automatically updates over here. And you notice I did that. I have live reload turned to true. And keep alive, if I didn't say keep alive, the server would kick up and then shut down immediately. And the reason for that is I want to keep alive because I actually want to run it. But if you just wanted to kick one up temporarily to run some tests or something, usually you want it to clean up after itself. So keep alive to true is important if you actually want to exercise the website in your browser. So if I go over here, let's go. Let's ignore that for a second, and let's open up our term 2, the bottom pane, and let's do grunt. Let's look at our watch file. Here's our watch file, and say grunt watch test. So we're going to, so this is the watch file, and this is the test. So we're saying we want to watch all the tests, and so any changes to my source files that I had defined previously, then I'll want to hint them and run the unit tests. So if I come into here, and let's say I take out this semicolon, or this brace, hit save, the watcher noticed, hey, something changed, and by the way, I'm going to run JS-hint, and oh, that was quite silly. You need to add in curly brace. So I'll add that back in, press save. The watcher immediately noticed I changed something, and now it linted everything. Everything is true. Same thing for my unit test. If I come over here, and this is a really silly unit test, but if 2 is equal to 1, I'll click save. Obviously, that failed in my unit test. That should not be true. So I would come over and save to 1. And again, I could have this window down here immediately. Another thing I didn't show, let me save to. When this fails, I turned off all notifications for this presentation. So normally we'd see the grunt show up like, hey, something happened, because I have the grunt notify. But anyway, I have that usually going, so it's in my face when something fails, and that's really nice. One other thing I wanted to show you, I briefly talked about it. Here's that page. It finally came up about the package JSON and the different parts of it. I guess it was just a slow site at the time, but if I hover over name on the right, it actually describes what that means. Contributors is just an array of people representing the project, and down here are the dev dependencies, and it kind of explains what that means, which is really nice. Let me go back to the code. Here in our aliases, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit. This is where you define, if I just say grunt by itself, it automatically looks at the default, and here are the things that this sample project will run. If I say tests, it'll run JS-hint and node unit. So if I come back over here, let's run it over here actually. If I said grunt test, then it would do those two things. It would first lint. Oh, did I do that wrong? Oh, tests. It would first lint all the things, and then it would test all the things, and then it gives me, obviously the graph. In this particular app, I don't have wired up, the page speed and things like that. I hope to add that over time, but before questions, I'm going to, again, you can catch me on my Twitter or my blog. The slides for this are bit.ly/Grunt-ify-fed, and then the lab, which is the code that you just saw, is at bit.ly Grunt-ify-fed-lab. Ralph, are there any questions?
Somebody was wondering if there were any plugins for Eclipse or Sublime available, like you were showing with other, like with Atom and WebStorm and stuff.
I would imagine. I haven't used Eclipse in a really long time. There are plugins for a lot of it's the thing about Grunt is it's probably been around in the JavaScript world one of the longest time compared to like Gulp, and so there might not be a Gulp one yet, but I would be shocked if there wasn't a Grunt one yet. But yeah, I've just haven't used Eclipse in a long time. My term 2, yeah, I recently had. I'll put a link to that in the chat. I was frustrated. I was using what is it, Power Strip. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It has really colorful stuff and arrows, and it's like really fancy. But I found the project I just got on, the folders were really long, and I could barely type anything after the big long line at the bottom, power lines. And so I switched to something different. But I'll get you a link to both of those. It's really nice because it'll tell me what branch I'm on. It tells me how many items I'm above master or below master. This changes quite a bit based on what I'm doing, which is really kind of cool.